Amy Cuddy's was using animals to illustrate pride as well, and I think that's, the animals, they teach us about our body and embodied knowledge, as we've talked about before. I think and there are some examples from the book. Finnegan talks about learning to surf by monkey see, monkey do. Just again, sort of intuitive, embodied practice. Think about how often I think that's why adults get worse and worse at learning physical activities and coordination and stuff, is because they get so much more in their head. Like, they think in order to do something, to learn a new physical skill, I need to understand it first and then tell my body to do it. Whereas kids just go immediately following from the bodily intuition. There's a great description of Mark Renneker's van. Finnegan drives it around, and just there's a embodied identity that's communicated by the van. It says, I drag myself into the driver's seat, start the engine, and feel suddenly like a kid wearing his dad's overcoat. The sleeves fall to my knees, the hem brushes the floor. Mark is actually not much bigger than I am, just an inch or two taller, but the seat feels strangely vast. Even the steering wheel seems oversized, and the van itself feels less like a car than some high-bridged, sure-ruddered freighter as I steer it through the puddles and potholes of the Sloat parking lot. From the driver's seat, the van, its bed stacked high with surfboards, seems suffused with a big cat-stretching sense of power, of rangy well-being and good health. From this surf-rinsed king of beasts view of the world, I think I too might be inclined to evangelize. So even the car is like pride, embodied pride. I mentioned to you the story of the Crow chief Plenty-Coup and his haunting pronouncement after his nomadic tribe were put on the reservation and divorced from their way of life, their culture, sense of cultural purpose, and even sense of time were lost. And he said, after this, nothing happened. But I also mentioned the idea of a vision quest, and he developed a new mythology for the crow, based on the character of the chickadee bird, a mimic, chickadees mimic, or mimic sounds, and I think it's another great example of sort of learning from animals' embodied intelligence. And learning, animals are good metaphors for learning, for intuitive learning from the body. I'm still learning, I'm absorbing what this uncomfortable, scary experience has to teach me, despite the fact that it's not entirely accommodating me, obeying my will or whatever. So listen to this story about the chickadee. Young Plenty-Cou's dream calls on him, and it gives him ethical advice that seems designed to help him survive the cataclysmic rupture that's about to occur. Become a chickadee. He is least in strength, but strongest of mind among his kind. He is willing to work for wisdom. The chickadee person is a good listener, Nothing escapes his ears, which he has sharpened by constant use. Whenever others are talking together of their successes and failures, there you will find the Chickadee person listening to their words. Becoming a Chickadee, then, is a virtue, a form of human excellence. One trains oneself by sharpening one's ears. One acquires the ability to learn from the wisdom of others. And after one acquires this character trait, a new form of excellence opens up. One can survive the coming storm. The lodges of countless bird people were in the forest when the winds charged it. Only one is left unharmed, the lodge of the Chickadee. Chickadee virtue called for a new form of courage, yet it drew on the traditional resources of Crow culture to do so. The Chickadee is big medicine. Finnegan also uses the metaphor of a bird to evoke a new rhythmic physical texture of communication, a new kind of listening. So he says in Fiji, I loved watching people chat even when I understood nothing, which was often since they usually spoke Fijian. They seemed to have an enormous repertoire of gentle, intricate social expressions. They used their mouths, hands, eyes, all the usual communication apparatus, but also chins, brows, shoulders, everything. Watching people listen was even better. There was a lovely, widely shared mannerism that I couldn't recall seeing before. A slight, jerky shifting of the head from side to side, a constant cocking of the neck, notch by notch, the way a bird does. I read it as a gesture of extreme tolerance. The listener was continually resettling his mind at different angles in order to take in different speakers, different impressions, with maximum equanimity. We Kavalangis, I think that means white campers, provoked a visible speed up of this mental spinal repositioning, I thought, but that might have been paranoia. So this is fascinating. He's noticing a new way of noticing. He's noticing it. He's paying attention to a different way of paying attention. I think that's exactly what the Chickadee virtue is about. It's like noticing other ways of communicating. And I like how what he says here at the end about about feeling paranoid. Like he's describing his own mind as a source of static, like noise, confusion, of being out of sync, physically out of sync, emotionally out of sync with the proper sort of wavelength of communication. So communication is a thoroughly physical kind of interaction with very specific, subtle, proper texture, pattern, and rhythm. And notice too how he refers to, I read it as a gesture of extreme tolerance. So he's reading a gesture of communication. So this communication as an openness, an openness to new forms of communication. So again, learning from the body, learning from the environment, learning from, interaction with the environment is what a basic idea of adventure. This woman, Emily Harrington, just did a historic ascent of this cliff in Yosemite called El Capitan. And I just want you to think about, like, is it part of this idea of adventure sports, or what makes the idea of a sport makes maybe rock climbing and surfing and other kind of outdoor adventure activities, maybe not entirely apply to the idea of a sport. That so the play, as Finnegan puts it, in terms of interlacing, everything was out in the waves. Everything's interlaced with everything else. The goal, the playing field, my home and my nemesis. What distinguishes adventure from conquest? Learning what the frontier has to show me, rather than imposing myself on the frontier, conquering it, possessing it, appropriating it to myself, to my own identity. Instead, letting it shape my identity, through this experience of listening, the Chickadee listening to my fear, or, learning something that I didn't know before, learning from the accidents, learning from the other, learning from what's strange, rather than appropriating the other and making it my own.
In fact, I can promise you I will never try to do that, but we can all relate to that feeling of being so intimidated by a challenge before you, but deciding to go forward. How did you think about it in that moment? How do you think about those kinds of challenges?
I mean, I think that those types of challenges and those moments when you're feeling uncomfortable, when you're feeling afraid, it's kind of the reason I climb. I think as human beings, and especially, for someone like myself, a lot of times, like, the way that I live is pretty comfortable, and I don't have to force myself into situations that feel uncomfortable or scary. And I think that sometimes those are the most important moments to experience, because they're the moments that we grow the most. And for me, that vehicle for experiencing that sort of edge is climbing. I think that a lot of times people shy away from being afraid. They shy away from that type of emotion. I think in reality, maybe we should try to get a little bit more comfortable with being afraid and sort of analyzing it. I think in a way it can become a strength.
These sports, like surfing and climbing, they depend on accidents of the landscape. You're just exploiting totally random accidents. That there happens to be a cliff of this kind. There happen to be waves of this kind. We're going to build up a sport and so on on the basis of that. So it's wild how advanced the sport of has been cultivated, how sophisticated and just rarefied, how athletes have invented forms of athleticism dictated by these cliffs. They became the kind of athletes they are because a cliff like El Capitan happened to exist. It's a reflection of that cliff. Here's Emily talking a bit about her inspiration. So here's El Cap here.
I mean, it's one thing to do it, it's another thing to do it fast. Why did you want to do that? Did you have somewhere to be?
Free climbing El Cap in a day has always been something that I've wanted to do as a climber. It's sort of like the epitome of big wall free climbing in our world. Just the challenge of like starting from the ground and climbing until you get to the top and not stopping on one of the biggest, most historic features in the world is pretty inspiring to me. And the fact doing it in a day just really distills it down into being only about climbing. So you don't have to bring a bunch of stuff to sleep. You're really just starting at the bottom and going to the top. And actually, one of the reasons I decided to do it was that the first human being ever to free climb El Capitan in a day was a woman via another route called the Nose, and her name is Lynn Hill, and she did it in 1994. And when I first started climbing, she was a huge inspiration to me. And so I don't know, for me it was just something that I'd always had in the back of my mind, but never really thought I would be able to do.
Emily, what did your parents think? Did you call them before? Did you say, I'll let you know when it's over?
The latter. I said I would let them know when it was over. They're used to stuff like this. I've been climbing for 23 years. I did call them on the summit, and they're super happy.
I go back to this question of fear, because those of us mortals down here just can't even imagine how you're able to do that. The athletic feat, the technical feat, but really more than anything else, the emotional feat of conquering fear. Alex Honnold, who's your buddy, who climbed part of this with you, I interviewed him when they did the documentary on his climb. I could not get a straight answer out of him, Emily, about do you feel fear? I was trying to ask him, but when I know that you overcome it, but when you're up there, are you afraid? And I guess the same question to you: when you're up there, are you afraid, or are you at some mental place past fear?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And let me just start out by saying I am very different from Alex. I don't know if he feels fear. He's very interesting in that way. I, for one, feel fear all the time. I am afraid. I deal with my fear pretty constantly in climbing. And I think more than anything, the idea to get past is the idea that you have to beat your fear, that you have to conquer your fear. I don't actually believe that that's a thing that we can do. I think once you feel it, it's there, and you kind of have to exist with it and learn how to move through it. So for me, it's less about conquering my fear and beating it, and more about sort of sitting with it and understanding it and recognizing why it's there, and then taking the steps to move through it and to almost use it in a way, almost become comfortable with that emotion and just sort of let it be, even though it's uncomfortable.
Learning from the cliff. So this cliff is this singular feature in the world that defined my dreams, my aspirations for myself as an athlete, and learning from role models. It's sort of like she mentioned Lynn Hill as someone she wanted to emulate. And she also sort of mentioned, I called my parents when it was over, parents become secondary to this quest, to this new parent, or one whose child she has chosen to be. So here's Alex Honnold, another great climber, talking about El Cap and how this, again, accident of geology, like the American continents, defined his identity, defined his aspirations for who he wanted to be, defines a whole, quote unquote sport or subculture of climbing, what excellence in climbing means.
It was always in the back of my mind as the obvious crown jewel of solos. It's the most striking wall in the world. Each year for the next 7 years, I'd think, this is the year that I'm going to solo El Cap. And then I would drive in Yosemite, look up at the wall, and think, no freaking way. It's too big and too scary. But eventually I came to accept that I wanted to test myself against El Cap. It represented true mastery.
I think that's pretty interesting. It's this accidental chunk of rock defines what mastery means. It's a kind of fatalism. We're learning from accidents of fate, accidents of circumstance. There just happens to be this big rock here. Who we are and what we're here for, what mastery means, and it's funny. It's called El Capitan, that like the captain. It's called the master, in a way. This underscores another aspect of childlike learning, the distinctive intelligence of children that Alison Gopnik talks about in terms of over-imitation. Because if learning is not directed by explicit knowledge, it's not directed by what the teacher intends to be teaching, or what the student is supposed explicitly, expected to learn. That means that learning happens by a kind of wholesale imitation. We imitate, the child imitates without knowing precisely which aspects of the imitation are the important ones. It's a holistic. It's sort of like the way children learn languages. They don't know the grammar, what they're supposed to be learning. They absorb the whole thing, and accents, mannerisms, gestures, along with the grammar, get absorbed. Gopnik's example for this is when she's whisking eggs together for her, baking a cake for her grandson. Her grandson's watching her, and the grandson sees that she does it in kind of an over-elaborate, dramatized way. He imitates this gesture, not because he knows that makes the eggs fluffier, but because this principle of over-imitation, of just absorbing all the accidents and trying to learn from everything. This reminds me of how Finnegan talks about the sort of literature and movies that inspired his dreams when he was young. In 96, he writes, "The newly emerging ideal was solitude, purity, perfect waves far from civilization. Robinson Crusoe, Endless Summer. This was a track that led away from citizenship in the ancient sense of the word toward a scratched-out frontier where we could live as latter-day barbarians." So it's pretty interesting that he's talking about, the frontier and the barbarian existence, but he's learning it from movies and literature. Here's a little clip where Finnegan actually he discusses the movie a little bit, Endless Summer.
As a kid, the Endless Summer was really influential. It was about two surfers from California who travel around the globe looking for waves, and they find the perfect wave in South Africa. They show this beautiful, beautiful little wave just reeling down along the rocks.
He knew he'd finally found that perfect wave.
The narrator saying these waves
look like they've been made
by some kind of machine. But there is no such thing as a perfect wave in the ocean. In nature, a wave is this kind of complex, violent event.
So that's pretty great. He actually imitates, he repeats verbatim the lines from the movie. So we learn from the environment, not just from the natural environment, but from movies, books, technological media. But it's important to distinguish between learning from the information, the explicit doctrine that's, the teacher teaches, or the book teaches, or the movie teaches, the information that you're explicitly supposed to or expected to gather, that's communicated by these various media, but from the whole experience, the way in which it informs your dreams, in all sorts of unpredictable ways, like the idea of over-imitation, learning through over-imitation. You don't know what you're expected, what the actual content is. Or the child is attending to the entire form. Finnegan also mentioned this book, Umi, the Hawaiian Boy That Would Be King, how that sort of colored his imagination, his fantasies as a young kid. I totally relate to that too. I had a lot of